Nobody handed Cape Verde a ticket to the knockout rounds. They earned every single point the hard way, unbeaten, underfunded, and written off before they ever set foot on a pitch. And now, the smallest nation in the history of the FIFA World Cup to advance past the group stage is about to line up against the defending world champions. Let that sink in for a second. This is not just a sports story. This is a collision of everything that's broken and everything that's beautiful about modern football, happening at the exact same time, on the exact same stage, in the exact same tournament. Let's start from the beginning. Not from the first game, but from the moment FIFA decided to blow the whole tournament up and rearrange everything. The 2026 World Cup was controversial long before a single ball was kicked. When FIFA President Gianni Infantino pushed through the expansion from 32 to 48 teams back in 2017, the backlash was immediate and loud. The European Club Association, representing powerhouses like Real Madrid, Barcelona, Bayern Munich, and Manchester United, released a statement calling the decision politically motivated rather than driven by sport. They said they saw no advantage in changing a format that had worked for decades. A campaign group called New FIFA Now went further, calling it a straight-up, quote, money and power grab, warning that it would undermine the competitiveness of the tournament. La Liga president Javier Tebas, never one to hold back, said Infantino was acting like Blatter, making unilateral decisions without consulting the people actually in the game. And those criticisms never really went away. They just got louder by the time the tournament arrived in the United States, Canada, and Mexico this summer. Then, just weeks before kickoff, UEFA President Alexander Ceferin reportedly made remarks suggesting that a huge number of matches in the expanded format were completely uninteresting. 13 World Cup nations, including Cape Verde, Ghana, Senegal, Egypt, South Africa, Ivory Coast, and others across Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean, fired back with a joint statement calling Ceferin's comments profoundly disappointing and a disregard for the dedication and sacrifices of players, coaches, clubs, and fans across the globe. They didn't mince words. They said every nation that qualifies deserves respect, and every match holds significance for millions of people worldwide. For the record, Cape Verde was one of the signatories of that statement. And then they went out and proved the point in a way no press release ever could. But the political chaos surrounding this World Cup runs much deeper than an argument over how many teams get to play. The tournament being held inside the United States under President Donald Trump's administration created a situation that, frankly, has no precedent in the history of the World Cup. The U.S. is currently in a military conflict with Iran, one of the participating nations. That marks the first time in World Cup history that the host country is in active hostilities with a competing team. The State Department and the Trump administration confirmed that Iranian fans would be subject to a total travel ban, with only the national team and essential support staff permitted entry. Fans from Haiti faced the same complete ban. And it wasn't just those two countries where the situation got complicated. Stricter visa requirements effectively shut out large numbers of supporters from multiple participating nations. Immigration advocates and fan groups raised alarms about the possibility of immigration and customs enforcement agents operating near World Cup venues. The U.S. government did not rule out the potential for checks or arrests in the vicinity of stadiums. The result was a climate of anxiety that affected not just fans from politically sensitive countries, but anyone traveling internationally who had concerns about the current U.S. immigration environment. Meanwhile, Infantino himself made headlines, and not for football reasons. He showed up wearing a red USA hat alongside President Trump at a so-called peace meeting and then handed Trump a newly created award called the FIFA Peace Prize at the official World Cup draw. FIFA's own regulations explicitly require political neutrality. Critics argued Infantino had abandoned that neutrality entirely, trading it for influence and access in the host nation. For an organization that spent years trying to rebuild its credibility after the corruption scandals of the Blatter and Platini era, the optics were, at minimum, difficult to defend. Ticket pricing added another layer of controversy. Premium tickets to the final were initially listed at around $11,000. FIFA's dynamic pricing system meant costs swung wildly based on demand. Fan groups and consumer advocacy organizations accused FIFA of price gouging and a lack of transparency. Attorneys general from New Jersey and New York launched formal investigations into FIFA's ticketing practices. FIFA also runs its own official resale market, taking a 30% commission on every transaction, a detail that critics said made it impossible for ordinary fans to access the tournament at anything close to a reasonable price. And then there was the environmental argument. Estimates from environmental organizations suggested the tournament could produce over 9 million tons of carbon dioxide, driven largely by the sheer volume of air travel required to move fans and teams between venues spread across 3 countries and dozens of cities. Environmentalists labeled it potentially the most damaging World Cup ever staged in terms of its carbon footprint. So that's the backdrop. That's the World Cup that Cape Verde walked into. A tournament wrapped in political controversy, financial scandal, environmental backlash, and a structural debate about whether the whole thing had been stretched too thin in pursuit of revenue and votes. And into all of that walked a team of 500,000 people. Cape Verde is an archipelago of 10 small islands sitting off the west coast of Africa with a total population of roughly 525,000. That's smaller than most mid-sized American cities. They're the 3rd smallest nation by population to ever qualify for a World Cup. And as of this week, they are comfortably the smallest nation in the history of the entire tournament to reach the knockout rounds. A country so small you could fit its entire population inside a couple of NFL stadiums just eliminated 2 former world champions from the group stage and finished 2nd in their bracket on merit. The squad value numbers make it almost comical. According to data from The Athletic, France's roster at this tournament is valued at $1.76 billion. England comes in at $1.58 billion. Spain, the team Cape Verde drew with in their very first World Cup match, sits at $1.42 billion. Portugal, $1.17 billion. All the major football nations come in north of $500 million. Cape Verde's entire squad is valued at $63.2 million. Spain's squad is worth more than 22 times that. Cape Verde didn't show up as a slightly weaker version of the competition. On paper, they came from a different universe entirely, and they didn't lose. Now let's go game by game because each one of these deserves its own chapter. The opener was against Spain, the reigning European champions, the team loaded with Barcelona and Real Madrid talent, the team that a huge portion of analysts and forecasting models had picked to win the entire tournament. Most people glanced at that matchup and started calculating goal differences. What actually happened was a tactical performance that should be studied in coaching academies for the next decade. Cape Verde sat in a compact, disciplined defensive shape and simply refused to come undone. Every time Spain tried to pull them out of position with quick combinations and movement, Cape Verde tracked, compacted, and refused to bite. Spain had 74% possession. They created 27 shots. They could not score, and standing between them and the goal was a 40-year-old goalkeeper named Vozinha, a man who plays his club football in the Portuguese 2nd Division, who put on one of the genuinely great individual goalkeeping performances of this entire tournament. 0-0. Group stage debut against the European champions. The world shrugged. Spain was rusty. They'd find their rhythm. It won't happen again. Then Cape Verde played Uruguay, 2-time world champions. A team built around players from the top leagues in Europe. A team with one of the most formidable attacking traditions in South American football. And Cape Verde didn't just absorb pressure. They went straight for the throat. Kevin Pina stepped up to a long-range free kick and drilled it in to give Cape Verde their first ever World Cup goal and their first ever World Cup lead. The dream was real. Then Uruguay responded, hitting back with 2 goals before halftime to go 2-1 up. And that should have been where the script closed. The underdog gets their moment of magic, gives up the lead, loses narrowly, and bows out gracefully. That's how these stories usually end, except Cape Verde didn't read the script. Midfielder Helio Varela pounced on a careless Uruguayan back pass and rolled it coolly into an empty net, 2-2 against two-time world champions from behind. Cape Verde leveled the game and held it. That's not a fairy tale anymore. That's a football team. The third and final group game was against Saudi Arabia. Two teams with something to play for, scrappy football, very few clear opportunities. It wasn't pretty. Vozinha made a handful of crucial saves to keep the clean sheet. The game finished 0-0, and at the final whistle, Cape Verde's players had absolutely no idea whether they were through. They did something that has basically never happened in the professional game at this level. They crowded around a single phone in the middle of the pitch and watched the final minutes of Spain versus Uruguay in real time. They needed Uruguay to not win. When the scoreboard confirmed Spain had taken it 1-0, the reaction was instant and overwhelming. Grown men in blue shirts collapsed on the turf. Some wept. Some couldn't stand. The reserve players sprinted from the bench. The coaching staff embraced. A nation of 500,000 people had just reached the knockout stages of the FIFA World Cup on their very first attempt. 3 games, 3 draws, 0 defeats. And here's where the political argument against the 48-team format gets completely dismantled by what Cape Verde actually did. The lazy take, and it has been floating around quite a bit, is that a team like Cape Verde only got here because FIFA watered down the competition and made it easier to advance. Let's be precise about why that argument falls apart. Cape Verde didn't sneak through as one of the lucky third-place finishers. They finished second in their group on merit, unbeaten, and they got to this World Cup by winning their African qualifying group, finishing ahead of Cameroon, a 5-time African champion and the most experienced World Cup nation on the continent. They didn't get a wild card. They didn't limp through a playoff. They qualified straight and then went unbeaten through the group stage of the tournament itself. That makes Cape Verde the 3rd African nation ever to go unbeaten through the group stage on their tournament debut, and the first African debutante to advance from the group since Ghana back in 2006. This is not a product of an expanded tournament handing out charity spots. This is a properly organized, properly coached football team that built something over years and then executed it under the biggest pressure imaginable. Their head coach, widely known as Bubista, wrapped the Cape Verde flag around his shoulders after the Saudi Arabia result and said what his team had been living from the beginning: "We are a small country, but we fight for the things we want to achieve." He had said before a single game was played that everyone is entitled to dream and nothing is impossible. His players went out and turned that into a verifiable, documented, historical fact. Bubista's philosophy that the scale of a country's resources doesn't determine what it can achieve once players are on the pitch is exactly what UEFA's Ceferin and every other establishment voice dismissing the expanded tournament refuses to engage with. Once you're on that field, he said, a lot of things become equal. The 48-team format gave Cape Verde a ticket in. What they did with it was entirely their own work. But if this whole story has one face, it belongs to Vozinha, 40 years old, 2nd Division club goalkeeper, a man who genuinely considered walking away from international football after being dropped during a failed Africa Cup of Nations qualifying campaign. The man who came within a hair of never making it to this stage, and now he is arguably the most talked about goalkeeper at the entire World Cup. His Instagram following exploded past 16 million followers practically overnight. In the stands at Houston's NRG Stadium, fans showed up holding giant placards printed with his face. Groups of young men painted the letters VOZINHA across their chests in blue paint. One kid held up a sign that read, "In Vozinha, we trust." When Portugal played in that same stadium days earlier, the crowd erupted for Cristiano Ronaldo, one of the most famous athletes alive. Then Cape Verde played, and it was a 40-year-old 2nd Division goalkeeper getting those same roars from the same crowd. There's a detail inside that story that hits even harder. Vozinha's mother, Ana Candida Evora, almost didn't make it to see her son play. She missed his standout 7-save performance against Spain because of a visa problem. The same kind of bureaucratic obstacle this tournament has created for fans from dozens of nations. By the time Saudi Arabia came around, her visa had been resolved. She sat in a luxury suite, waving a small Cape Verde flag while 65,000 people chanted her son's name. Vozinha summed the whole thing up simply: "We are small, but we have big hearts, and we are fighters." He added that the whole purpose of coming to this World Cup was to show the world that Cape Verdean players have quality, that they can compete, and that they belong on the biggest stage in football. Even the team's kit manufacturer tells an underdog story. While over 3/4 of the nations at this World Cup wear Nike, Adidas, or Puma, Cape Verde are outfitted by a small company called Capelli Sport, founded by a Lebanese immigrant who arrived in the United States in the 1980s and built his business from a basement in Brooklyn. 2 underdogs, both at their first World Cup. Cape Verde's blue shirts carry a triangular pattern based on the flight paths between the islands, a design the brand called "Connected Through Rhythm." Every single detail of this team is a story about punching above your weight. And now comes the moment the whole story has been building toward. On July 3rd in Miami, Cape Verde face Argentina, the defending world champions, Lionel Messi, the greatest player in the history of the sport. On paper, it is an absurd mismatch, the smallest nation ever to reach the knockout rounds against the team that has dominated international football for the better part of a decade. The realistic expectation is that this is where the dream ends. Argentina are organized, experienced, and lethal in knockout rounds. But look honestly at what Cape Verde has shown in 3 games and ask yourself whether realistic expectations mean anything anymore when it comes to this team. Their midfielder Doi Duarte said it straight after qualifying: "It's mad. I feel like I'm in a dream." It's against Argentina, isn't it? A tough match. But let's believe anything is possible. Their defender Pachico Lopez reinforced the message. They got here on merit, they belong at this level, and they're not done proving it. The backdrop to that game in Miami is also impossible to ignore from a purely political standpoint. The United States, the host nation, is a country where the current administration has made immigration enforcement a central policy priority. The World Cup is happening in that same country, and the team representing Cape Verde, a small African island nation, many of whose players were born or raised in Portugal, the diaspora scattered across Europe, is about to walk into one of the most politically charged sporting venues on the planet and face the defending champions. The irony is sharp. A tournament that critics called watered down produced the most extraordinary underdog story since at least Greece in 2004, and arguably the most remarkable group stage run by a small nation in the entire history of the competition. A tournament that was supposed to generate meaningless matches between overmatched nations produced a story that the entire football world, including every UEFA official who doubted it, cannot stop talking about. Whether Cape Verde beat Argentina on July 3rd or not, the point is already made in a way that press conferences and policy arguments never could. You cannot look at what this team has done, at what Vozinha has done, at what Bubista built, at those players huddled around a phone in the middle of NRG Stadium in Houston, watching Spain beat Uruguay, and tell the world that small nations don't belong here. 13 nations signed that letter rejecting Safran's dismissal of expanded World Cup matches as uninteresting. Cape Verde signed it too. And then Cape Verde went out and settled the argument on the pitch. A sign in the stands during their final group game said, "What 1,000 op-eds couldn't. Small islands, big dreams, July 3rd in Miami." Blue Sharks versus the defending world champions. This is where history is going to be made one way or another.